Thank you, Professor Shad. Professor Shad is an expert on constitutional law and human rights issues. He is currently holding Tunku Abdurrahman Chair, Faculty of Law in University of Malaya. He's written extensively and has been published extensively. He's worked for almost 5 decades in University Technology Mara as a professor of law, currently serving in the newly formed IRC, Institutional Reforms Committee. We are very honored to have Professor Shad with us today. He had spoken very substantially on the issues, on the serious issues of Islamophobia, both from the global perspective as well as from the local perspective, and has given us some very interesting insights on how Muslims themselves are culpable in this trend of Islamophobia and how we do actually contribute to it. So with this, I would like to invite Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. He will join us with his comments and with his insights on the issue. Dr. Chandra doesn't need an introduction. He is one of Malaysia's very own global intellectuals, leading a quest for alternative visions towards peace, cooperation, and multilateralism, for a compassionate civilization, for a world of values and morality rather than propaganda and paranoia. So Professor Chandra is here with us today. We are honored to have him, and I would like to pass the floor to Professor Chandra.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Moderator, Elma Berisha, our guest speaker, Professor Kenney, fellow panelists, Professor Shad Faruqi, Dr. Farooq Musa, friends. Assalamu alaikum, salam sujatra, peace be with you. I would like to begin by thanking IRF, Islamic Renaissance Front, for this kind invitation. I'm going to be brief, partly because I have to leave quite soon. But the main points that I want to make in relation to Professor Kenney's presentation, which I thought was very comprehensive. The main points would be related to a phenomenon that he highlighted, which I would like to explore in greater detail. And in the process, I hope we would be able to understand Islamophobia in greater depth. The point that I'm referring to is terrorism. Professor Kenney had said that terrorism had contributed a great deal to Islamophobia. And I think this is absolutely true. Not just in Europe or the Western world, but also in the non-Western world. If Islamophobia has become a phenomenon in many parts of the non-Western world today, in Korea, in Japan, in China, and in parts of Southeast Asia, it is largely because of terrorism, its alleged association with Muslims, and the way in which the media has highlighted this, the way in which the media has disseminated this view of terrorism. So let's try to look at terrorism in greater depth. And if we try to understand terrorism in greater depth, we would realize that this attempt to link Islam and Muslims with terror and violence is not new. It has been happening for a long while, for at least 1,000 years. This attempt to link violence and terrorism with Islam. Karen Armstrong, who, as you know, had written a great deal about Islam and also other religions, she makes this very interesting point that when the West, the centers of power in the West were condemning the Muslims for violence very, very early, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, projecting Islam as a violent religion and the Prophet in particular as a person who had used force, inclined towards violence. This was also the time when the princes of Europe had embarked upon the Crusades. And the violence of the Crusades is something that surpassed the violence that other civilizations have had. And this is something that is not highlighted. That they killed not just the Muslims in Jerusalem and in other parts of West Asia. They killed Jews. In fact, more Jews were killed by the Crusades than Muslims. They killed even Christians. Christians from the Eastern Church, they were massacred by these crusaders from Europe. So there was terrible violence committed by the centers of power in the West, the princes, their leaders, and yet this violence was transferred to the Muslims. The Muslims were projected as those who were violent. That is the religion that had spread through the sword. This had begun very early, this depiction of Islam. So Karen Armstrong argues it was an attempt to transfer their guilt, their wrongdoing to someone else. And this, she argues, they have done over and over again. So that's a point that one has to keep in mind, talking about violence. As far as the contemporary period is concerned, what's happening today, the violence which has influenced a lot of people into developing this phobia about Islam. There are perhaps three major dimensions to this contemporary violence that we have to try to understand. And then perhaps we should look at ways of overcoming the consequences emanating from this violence and terror. Number one, let us admit this very candidly. There is no doubt that there is a fringe within the Muslim world that believes fervently that they have to resort to violence in order to change the world. To make the world a better place, perhaps, in order to ensure that Islam flourishes, in order to project what they see as the greatness of Islam. They do believe in resorting to violence, a fringe. They subscribe to Islamic State, Islamic Caliphate, to a distorted notion of jihad, but they believe in this. And there are groups that have emerged in the last few decades that indulge in violence. We cannot deny this. So there is this element that we must keep in mind too. And this is something within the Ummah. It's a challenge that the Ummah has to deal with, and we'll come to that in a while. Number two, a lot of the violence, including the violence that we've seen in Europe and in some other parts of the world, is in a sense reactive. It's Muslims reacting to a certain situation, reacting to the conquest of their own lands, reacting to the usurpation of their rights, to the expulsion of their people. Palestine is a good example. Because if you look at the first wave of violence linked to some Muslim groups after the Second World War, it is clearly linked to the Palestinian issue. The hijackings, the massacres that had taken place in some places, it is linked to Palestine. That a people had been dispossessed and they were angry, unhappy. They wanted some solution. They could not get help from other Arab governments. They could not get help from the international community. They felt that they had to tell the world that this had happened and perhaps do it in a manner that most of us wouldn't endorse. But they had to do it, and they did it that way. But it's not just Palestine. Look at Iraq, the violence associated with Iraq. Perhaps 1 million killed. Again, usurpation of someone else's land. creating chaos in a country which, in spite of all its weaknesses, it was fairly stable, playing one group against the other. The Sunni-Shia conflict in Iraq, which of course had existed certain periods of Iraqi history, but there were also long periods where Shias and Sunnis worked together in Iraq, especially in the fight against British colonialism. But all those things are forgotten, and instead you create this feud amongst different Muslim groups, you create utter chaos, turmoil. And one has to try to understand the impact of that invasion of 2003. If you have a situation where depleted uranium had been used so extensively that to this day there are babies born in Iraq with deformities that we trace directly or indirectly to what had happened. If out of 5 children that a mother gives birth in Fallujah, 4 of them are deformed, can you imagine what that war had done? But this is not highlighted. But the anger, the antagonism towards certain groups, it's a result of conquests and destructive, devastating acts of the soul. So let's keep that in mind. This happened over and over again to various Muslim countries. There's also Afghanistan. Invasion, 2001, 7th October 2001. It has not ended. It is the United States of America's longest war. Afghanistan is still going on. And there is no solution. Thousands and thousands have been killed. So all this must generate anger, which gives rise to suicide bombers and senseless killings, and that in turn generates Islamophobia. Look at the Muslims, see what they do. But there is a reason, there's a history, there's a background which the media seldom highlights. And of course, the leaders in the West don't talk about this. When they talk about violence in the Muslim world and terrorism, they leave out this genealogy, the history, the background to situations like this. First-class example of a leader who talks this way is Tony Blair, supposed to be in charge of resolving problems in West Asia. But he would never ever refer to this history. He says this is a problem within the Muslim world. But the sins committed by the centers of power in the West, they are concealed and camouflaged. A third dimension, as far as violence is concerned. It is not just conquest and hegemony and the politics of dominance and power. We see a lot of terrorism. And we know, after what has happened in Syria, that a lot of the terrorism is manufactured, created by the centers of power in the West itself. This is so well established now that there's no way one can deny this. You will never find the mainstream Western media talking about this. You will never find Western academics writing about this. But this is a fact. This is a fact because no one has been able to refute the evidence produced by journalists like Robert Fisk and Eric Margolis, and by numerous other writers, and by people who have provided documentary evidence of the flow of weapons from various sources to the so-called rebels in Syria, who are actually militants, a lot of them from other parts of the world, at one point 80,000 to 90,000 from various parts of the world. And of course, some Syrians, assisted by arms, assisted by training, provided in Jordan and other places, intelligence provided by the CIA and the British intelligence to help these terrorists. For them, the manual, what they thought they could achieve in Syria, was what they achieved in Afghanistan. That they had created a massive global movement to overthrow the Soviet-linked government in Kabul. They thought the same thing could be done in Syria. Totally different situation. And they failed. But there's no doubt at all that they were behind terrorism. that they were the sponsors, the supporters, the aiders, the abettors of terrorism. And then, of course, you put the blame on the Muslims. Look at the way in which these terrorists operate and so on. Why is it that, to give you just one small, recent, very recent, 2 days ago, this example which I mentioned at the conference that I spoke at a couple of days ago in Ho Chi Minh City, that a thing like this can happen, and yet the truth about that story was not highlighted in the media at all. Why do you think 800 white helmets from Syria, the so-called white helmets, first responders, humanitarian assistance group, so-called, why were they given tremendous help? They were all taken out of Syria with the help of Israel. Israel had sponsored the entire operation with the help of Jordan, and they're going to be transported to European countries. These white helmets, there's documentary evidence showing how they fought side by side with Al-Qaeda and Daesh. This is not a fabrication. The person who created the white helmets was a former British intelligence officer. It was done at a meeting in Turkey. These are the people who are part of the war, to overthrow a legitimate government. Whatever one may say about Bashar al-Assad, his was a legitimate government. And there was this concerted attempt to overthrow him as part of this attempt to change the map of West Asia, which has been an ongoing struggle on the part of the hegemons. This is what Israel wanted. This is what the United States wanted. Britain, France, all of them were part of it. Turkey, for other reasons, was part of it. Qatar was part of it for a while. And most of all, Saudi Arabia. The attempt to get rid of Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government. In itself, perhaps not that important to them, but part of the larger politics of the region. It is linked with oil and gas. It is linked with Hezbollah. It's linked with Iran. Perhaps most of all, Iran. Now, they have become the active supporters of terrorism, actively involved in terrorism. So these are the factors that we must keep in mind when we talk about terrorism. Don't just conclude, oh, these are some Muslim madcaps who are going around doing these things. There are other forces behind them who have got the agenda and who are perpetuating the agenda. And that brings me to the second and last part. How do we overcome this? The terrorism that has emerged from within Islam, the violence justified, wrongly of course, by Muslim theologians and Muslim activists and so on, that is something that we have to fight ourselves, meaning by which the Muslims. We have to show that this is totally against the religion. This is a distortion of jihad. There is no such notion of a caliphate in Islam, a caliphate which perpetuates killings against women, against minorities, that notion of caliphate. We have to debunk this falsehood, this distorted, perverted narrative that has taken hold of a certain segment of the Muslim world. We have to fight that. Through the written word, we have to fight this through our campaigns. We have to do everything possible through peaceful means in order to get rid of this, to purge the Muslim body politic of this poison. Number two, we have to fight hegemony. You cannot say, let's have a peaceful world, let's get rid of terrorism and so on, and yet say nothing about hegemony. To my mind, that is unethical, immoral. You are being utterly dishonest. If you don't criticize hegemony, dominance, control, which has led to all this, and yet talk about terrorism. So I think one has to take a clear stand against hegemony. And amongst the people who are helping hegemony to perpetuate itself are Muslim leaders and Muslim governments. They're working hand in glove. It's a fact. Look at what Mohammed bin Salman is doing in Saudi Arabia. the game that he's playing, that's part of the hegemonic game. Look at what others have done, the former leaders of Pakistan. There's a change of government now. I think that's a good thing. I hope the new Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, would be able to marshal resources to bring about some changes at least in Pakistan. But the Pakistani elite, big segment of them, the elite in Afghanistan, in many other Muslim countries, they've been working with the perpetrators of hegemony. I think this has to come to an end. But not just them, but others too, who have perpetuated hegemony. And of course, the centers of power in the West itself, one hopes that their own people will stand up against hegemony. In the United States of America, in Britain, in France, and other countries, don't talk about violence and terrorism and about how terrible the world is, and yet maintain studied silence on hegemony, dominance, and power. That's something very, very important. We have to get this across. And with the friends that we have, and the friends that we've been working with, for instance, just for more than 20 years, a big part of our work has been with progressive groups in the West itself, in standing up against hegemony. And many of them, I think you've heard of groups like the Palestinian rights movement in the United States of America, Christian Palestinian groups in America were very, very active. We've been playing a really effective role in conscientizing people, in raising awareness. I think this is part of the larger challenge. And you have such individuals and groups in Britain, in France, in Germany. It's so important for us to strengthen our ties with them to bring about this change. And the third and last point I want to make, I think it is so important to disseminate the correct information about situations. I think we saw in Professor Kenney's presentation how the lack of understanding, knowledge, sometimes can lead to situations that are really quite tragic. People have to know what is happening. There has to be this sort of knowledge, information. And especially in the context of what we're discussing, we have to know each other. It is a fundamental maxim in the Quran itself. It's something you will find in other traditions, expressed in other ways. The importance of people who are different from one another, knowing one another, establishing ties, interacting with one another. It's not the sort of dialogue that we have sometimes had in the past where we avoid the difficult issues. It's not the sort of dialogue where you try to achieve a certain degree of consensus on theological issues. It's of no use. It doesn't help. It's not going to happen. What we're talking about is the sort of dialogue that is linked to actual living. The dialogue that is linked to fighting drug abuse, problems of AIDS, for instance. I know that such dialogues are happening in various parts of the world. Dialogue related to healthcare. Dialogue related to the situation of unwed mothers, of single mothers. It's that sort of dialogue where people really work together on things that are concrete and real. Because experiences of this sort will bring us together and build a very firm and durable bond. That's what we should work towards, that sort of dialogue. I'm sure some of you are aware that there are such dialogues happening in Malaysia too. Interfaith groups working at the grassroots level. ABIM has been part of it, and many other groups. I think this is the sort of dialogue that we should encourage in this country and elsewhere. So there is hope. In fact, if you look at the overall situation, we are also concerned about various things that are happening, different trends and so on. But at the same time, if you look at the world and you look at Malaysia and other countries, there is hope. I think people are reaching out to one another. I will not be distracted by isolated cases here and there, as if they define the entire dialogue, the entire situation. I think those situations are there. We should take a position, but let us not be overwhelmed by these things. To give you a very specific example, for me, the thing about the 41-year-old man marrying an 11-year-old girl, it is something that one has to address, yes, but it doesn't define marriage among Muslims. Why is it that we treat it as if it is the be-all and end-all of our inner society? It is not. The late Edward Said used to say, talking about this sort of attitude, where people just pick up little things here and there. He was criticizing V.S. Naipaul. V.S. Naipaul, who you know had a very bigoted view about the world. And Edward Said used to say that these are the scavengers. They are the scavengers. You pick up little things like this and say, oh, this is what is happening to this country, this is what's happening to the world. I don't think that's fair. Look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture offers hope. And one should work towards that. We can bring people together and we should highlight these things. Every day I get information about interfaith action, not just interfaith dialogue, from a friend of mine in India who has been working on this for decades. And there are thousands of examples of Sikhs helping to build a mosque, about Muslims helping to build a church, things of that sort. These things are happening, but they're never highlighted. So let's look at this other dimension when we talk about issues of this sort. And at the same time, the things that are really important, like hegemony, let's not ignore these things. Let's not ignore the impact of power upon issues like ours. Islamophobia cannot be separated from the question of power. Right through the history of interaction between the Muslim world and the West, power has been central. Power has been central. You look at the Crusades, you look at colonialism, you look at the spread of Islam, and when Christian groups began to react against the spread from the 8th century onwards, it's all related to power. And if you look at the way in which Muslims behave in certain situations, where they're the majority, when they have power, again, it's related to power. So power is central to our understanding of issues like this. So look at these bigger issues and analyze them, try to overcome them. That is the real challenge. If we can do that, then I think as human beings, as citizens, we'll be making a contribution. Thank you.